Hi, good evening everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It is a privilege to welcome Nathan Law to St. Anne's College. Nathan is a Hong Kong democracy activist and former legislator who first came to international prominence during the 2014 Umbrella Movement, where he served as a prominent student leader. Advocating for greater democratic representation in Hong Kong, and in 2016, at the age of 23, he became the youngest member ever elected to the Hong Kong Legislative Council. Following his disqualification from office and subsequent imprisonment related to protest activities, Nathan has continued his advocacy internationally, speaking on issues of democratic governance, human rights, and the rule of law in Hong Kong. Today, we are very grateful to hear his reflections on Hong Kong's constitutional developments, the challenges facing democratic movements, and the broader implications for liberal democracies worldwide. Please join me in welcoming Nathan Law.
Thank you. Testing. Thank you, Hussein, for the introduction. Can everyone hear me? Great. Yes, it's great to be back to Oxford. I've been here a few times, speaking at different occasions, although the weather has always been a bit grim, but it's always good to be back. I want you to spend a few seconds to think about a truly life-changing moment that happened in your life. I was constantly reminded by one occasion that took place in 2020 that was really a transformational moment for myself. Because if I hadn't made that decision, I would have been in a very different place, going through different challenges and a different life. And I've been constantly reminded that how life could easily be ending up in a very strange place. 2 days ago, I'm sure some of you may have read the news about Jimmy Lai, a media mogul, a really strong campaigner for Hong Kong's democracy. There was a sentence for 20 years for his work on media, his work on democracy movement, etc. That was handed to him. It was the harshest sentencing ever took place under the national security law. And it made international headlines because people were just so shocked that a person who ran a newspaper, who criticized Beijing, and ended up receiving 20 years of imprisonment. And for me, it was, of course, a big shock, but the emotion was much more mixed. Because if I hadn't left Hong Kong in 2020, if I hadn't made that decision, I would have easily been in his position, where I was charged of colluding with foreign forces, where I was charged of sedition, and these are the crimes, the charges that the Hong Kong government put on me, and the reason why I'm still being wanted on the wanted list for that. So when I look at Jimmy's case, it's really disheartening. On the one hand, I know him. I wouldn't say that I'm a close friend of him, but I know him. I know that all the things that he has done, it was for the freedom and democracy of Hong Kong. But on the other hand, I felt so incredibly lucky and fortunate that I was able to wake up in my bedroom, that I was able to do the work that I'm doing and speaking to different journalists, wrote an op-ed at The Guardian, and attending to this talk and to share these stories to you all, because I felt like I have an immense guilt that I managed to leave Hong Kong, not for any other reasons, but just for freedom, finding some place that I can live more or less a normal human being and not being locked behind bars for decades. And that kind of makes me feeling really came after me whenever I saw news about Hong Kong. Terrible news, friends getting in jail, someone getting arrested, some terrible developments along the line. So in the past 5.5 years I've been spending in the UK, I was constantly reminded that that particular life-changing moment that I made that decision in 2020 keep having an impact in my life and keep reminding me how lucky I am, which to most people that is kind of like an absurd statement. I was forced, and I'm still forced, to leave my home. I live in the UK as a refugee. I've gone through like the refugee process. I have a lot of limitation, restriction in life. There has been coverage about the Hong Kong government hiring investigators to spy on me, and then some of them are on court being charged with the law in the UK. And there were like so many other incidents that make my life a bit more difficult than ordinary British citizen in the UK. But I still feel like on a constant basis that I'm incredibly grateful and fortunate for where I am. But when you look back to Hong Kong, there's the irony, right? Like, it is because how terrible Hong Kong's political development it is, and that's what makes me feel like so unfortunate that I made that decision and to be able to stay in the UK. But why? Like, why we ended up with Hong Kong? Like, there is no political diversity. The law is being weaponized to prosecute dissidents. People are worried about expressing their free opinions, and there are so many cases in the National Security Court that are just pure speech crime, and people were just losing that kind of hope to this place that we used to call home, and people used to call it as one of the freest cities in Asia. So it all really the story all goes back to the history of Hong Kong, and part of it overlaps with where my family is, my family roots. In the late 70s, my father, just like Jimmy Lai, he escaped from China to Hong Kong with nothing because there was a big famine, so there was no food, and the only hope of survival was to come to Hong Kong. So he made a very rough trip, saw many bodies on the open sea, and then he took 3 days from southern China and arrived to Hong Kong. And back then, there was a policy when you evade all the border controls and then arrive in the city center of Hong Kong, you automatically be granted working permit and residency. So he got it, and then he worked as a construction worker in Hong Kong. He told me that on the very first day after he arrived, he earned a year more of salary than the work that he did in mainland China. So it was completely life-changing for him. He stayed in Hong Kong. He lived there, and the handover was about to take place in 80s and 90s. In the 80s, when there was the negotiation with the British government and the Chinese government about the future of Hong Kong after roughly 115 years of colonial ruling, Hong Kong people were actually really nervous about it, because when you think about the kind of political and economic situation in the 70s and 80s in China, there were so many people that, like my father, came to Hong Kong for good reasons. There was really politically turmoil, and economically it was really deprived. So Hong Kong people were really nervous about in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, that they are going to be governed under the Chinese communist regime. So there was actually a lot of waves of immigrations in the 80s. Some of them came to the UK, and some of them went to Australia, Canada, and the US, etc. So you pretty much see a lot of Chinese restaurants in Chinatown, in those places. They were actually opened by Hong Kong immigrants. And there was a big anxiety and fear about the future of Hong Kong, so that the Chinese government, the British government came to sign a declaration that pretty much governed the future of Hong Kong, which is called the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1984. And some of the major pillars of that declaration was about freedom, about gradual process to democracy, about rule of law, etc. These are the components that Hong Kong people felt like that could protect them from the kind of disastrous future that is being governed under Chinese communist regime, and that gave Hong Kong people certain confidence that after 1997, after the sovereignty of Hong Kong was handed back from the British government to the Chinese government, that they could protect a certain degree of way of life. And that was the basis of the one country, two system that we have, that is currently being implemented to basically monitor and govern Hong Kong and instruct what Hong Kong people's current status and future look like. And fast forward to 1997, when the handover took place in the first 10 years, it was fine. Like there wasn't many major protests. There was one in 2003 when the Hong Kong government tried to introduce national security law, but it failed because pretty much back then China was still using these high and bite foreign policy. They were a much more reserved regime. They didn't really wanted to show their strength. They were trying to be sending signals about, oh, they were catching up the West. They were trying to liberalize. They were trying to democratize. So I would say in the early 2000s, it was a golden period of China's relationship with the rest of the world, because China had been sending these positive signals about them trying to adopt the Western model. And one of the implications was, look, Hong Kong was still doing okay. There wasn't much intervention from Beijing to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was like still maintaining that kind of liberal society outlook. And there were lots of praises about how free was Hong Kong and how many protesters were there in Hong Kong. And it kind of like demonstrated the leniency, the capacity and the eagerness of the Chinese regime trying to learn from the situation of Hong Kong. But of course, as we know, especially after Xi Jinping took power, China has become much more militant, emboldened with the authoritarian system. They have even encoded the whole confidence about the political system in their constitution, and things went south for Hong Kong. And that was the time I finished high school and get into universities and became a student leader in a democracy movement in 2014 when I was a freshman in the university. I would say that was not my intention. I'm here where I am because of many unexpected turns in my life. I remember when I was in a freshman in universities, I was still very puzzled whether I should be involved in like student activism and social movement, because of course there was a big family factor in it. As I said, my father was basically a refugee from China to Hong Kong, and he and my parents always taught me that don't mess up with politics, don't do anything stupid, just like focus on my study, get good grades, get good universities, and trying to climb up the social ladder. And they were, one of them, my father was a construction worker, my mother was a street cleaner. So they worked there, they worked really hard as a blue collar workers living in Hong Kong. And we spent basically the early part of my life in social housings, in public housings in Hong Kong. So life was fairly difficult, and you could really understand why they don't want me to be involved in politics, because they escape from the ramification of politics, and they always feel like this is dark, this is terrible, you can never kind of win over the Chinese Communist Party. So there was a lot of what I call refugee mentality radiated in my family education when I was growing up. So fast forward to my university life, I was basically hiding it from my mom that I was part of this student union, that we were about to be involved in one of the largest civil disobedience movement in Hong Kong and even in Asia, that we were fighting for democracy. And gradually, I think it was after a lot of incidents where I saw a lot of police brutality, when I saw a lot of my fellows, they were putting themselves at risk because they wanted to make a point and to stage protests against the political reform and the unjust limitation to our political freedom, that are gradually kind of like being sucked into this arena of political activism. And the most notable one was definitely I took place in the negotiation with the government in 2014 umbrella movement that really set me up as a public figure. So from someone who grew up and who lived in public housing, who my family education was just like stay out of politics, I was involved in student bodies and activism, and then becoming a public figure. And that was really the starting point of my activism and politics. Then I founded a political party. I ran for election. Gladly, I won the election. It was really a time of optimism for Hong Kong. There was this big protest, and there was like really a lot of young people trying trying to change the system, trying to be involved in social activism. And then it comes to 2019, when the big protest in Hong Kong took place. I would say that was really a magical moment. It is very difficult for anyone who can imagine such a big protest. The largest one was on 16th June 2019, when there were more than 2 million people marching down to the streets. It was literally more than 1/4 of the population of Hong Kong. Just try to imagine if that happens in anywhere else in the world, like in London or in New York, in any place. Things would pretty much change, right? But it didn't. The government still tried to quash the protest heavy-handedly. The bills that they tried to pass were still being forced to bypass our legislature, and the national security law came into full force in late June 2020. When you think about what Hong Kong people were being promised in the 90s, in the 80s, when the hangover was about to happen, and what Hong Kong has gone through, how Chinese regime has treated Hong Kong in the past decades, it was really the sense of betrayal that really motivated Hong Kong people to protest and campaign. And they had a really clear idea what they wanted, which is democracy and the right to elect their city's leader. But unfortunately, because of an unchecked regime and the regime in China that has been growing much more emboldened in the authoritarian direction that they're heading to, the pursuit for freedom and democracy in Hong Kong has been quashed. And since the big protest and the implementation of the national security law, there's already been close to 2,000 people being persecuted and went through jail because of that. And for the past few years that I've been spending outside of Hong Kong, there has been a lot of activism about raising awareness towards raising awareness to the political prisoners and the political turmoil in Hong Kong. But sadly, it is just not enough to move China, and we've been seeing more and more of ridiculous incidents and political cases coming out from Hong Kong. So I think if I wanted to kind of send a message or to conclude a little bit about what has happened to Hong Kong, I think the clearest one is if you let an unchecked power to do whatever they want, a lot of foundation of the civil society, foundations of rule of law and democracy can collapse in just a matter of months, a matter of 1 year. And that was exactly what has happened to Hong Kong. So I think it's really important to be vigilant citizens in whatever countries that you're in, especially in democracies, because I think the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And if you let the government to expand their power, to abuse their power without checks and balances, I think things happening in Hong Kong can easily be repeated elsewhere. So I'm aware that this is supposed to be a Q&A, so I really cut short of my presentation. I hope that I can open up more questions to both of you and to the audience. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for your speech. I mean, you said some really interesting words there. And obviously you mentioned just 2 days ago we saw the imprisonment of Jimmy Lai under this national security law. And today, the father of an activist also arrested under the national security law. You've previously mentioned a sort of complacency within the international community in their actions against China. Do you think a sentence like this signals that the diplomatic pressure from countries like the UK has failed in some way? And what kind of specific actions could the UK government undertake beyond the condemnation which may have failed?
I think this is a great question, and this is always like $1 million question. No one really have a magical wand to kind of make things happen and have a perfect solution on just pressuring China and also kind of balancing the interests of the UK. So I think it has always been a very difficult question for like activists and policymakers to make the right call. Looking back at national security law trial, I think a lot of people, we run into a risk where China and Hong Kong, because how close the media system, how limited that people can say, and the media can report, we run into a risk of kind of being fooled by the legal language used by the regime to just cover up their political persecution. So in China, it's fairly common that you see a human rights activist that being charged with tax evasion, or like he hit someone with a car 10 years ago with no evidence, etc. Like there is a very sophisticated way for China to just do political persecution with these cover-ups in plain legal language, in non-political legal language. And that is coming to Hong Kong as well. So you see this, a father of an activist that's being arrested, allegedly trying to kind of help her daughter, who is a wanted exile activist in the US, to handle like her insurance. And you also see that the government is using national security law to basically prosecute people that they don't like, where the law, first of all, was not passed in Hong Kong. It was directly imposed by Beijing. When the law was passed in 2020, even the chief executive, the leader of Hong Kong, she said that she didn't know the details of the law until the law, the full content of the law was handed to her kind of like a few days before it was implemented. So it was really clear that that was directly from Beijing, and that was the law written by the political will of Beijing. And then you can see like the national security courts that is set up to enforce the national security law. All the judges are handpicked by the chief executive, which is like loyal to Beijing. And then there's no jury, which is contrary to Hong Kong's common law system. And basically the conviction rate was almost perfect. So in this show trial, the government will say that, and pretty much like all kind of institutions which can still speak up will kind of like say that, oh, it is a showcase of like how strong Hong Kong's rule of law is. Everyone is equal in front of the law, even though you are a billionaire, etc. But the truth is, they have been setting up this legal authoritarianism to use the legal system as a weapon to persecute political opponents like Jimmy Lai and many others who were my friends. So I would say that one of the things that we can do is to continue to call out that kind of weaponization of the legal system and legal authoritarianism. And I think there isn't enough attention to that kind of changes in Hong Kong. And that could really put pressure to the reputation of Hong Kong as a sector of like a business. It used to be having a really robust reputation of being a really strong rule of law in terms of like commercial or like legal litigation, etc. I think that could really damage the kind of perception, to put more pressure to Beijing and Hong Kong to rethink about what they do. But of course, like there were a lot of a basket of policy recommendations from activists, ranging from sanctioning some of the officials and people who kind of like enable the kind of authoritarianism happening in Hong Kong, to really like doing a lot of strong statements, etc. I think that that's one way that we can say we can propose anything that we want, but there's another way that is really like looking at the situation from a realistic lens, which is like, I think the UK is also searching and puzzling about where it stands in this ever-changing geopolitical environment where global politics is a mess, where a lot of orders or even allyship that we used to know has been reshuffled. So I think I can really understand that there are a lot of confusion. There are eagerness for like middle power countries like the UK to try to test a different approach. But at the end of the day, I think, and this is what I said in the Guardian piece that I wrote yesterday on the Jimmy Lai case, that I think one of the strongest points in the UK, if there's anything that anyone can be proud of, which is like its democratic institution, and is pursued for liberalism and freedom. And I think if in the face of economic uncertainty or geopolitical reshuffle, that the government is willing to make it a subsidiary to allegedly economic gains, which there's no ground that we've got anything substantial from the kind of warming up the relationship with China. I think that is a really sad thing to see it unfold as someone who lives here, and to feel like this is somewhere that offers me refuge and safety.
Thank you, Nathan. I wanted to talk a bit about activism in Hong Kong and ask the question, what do you think is more likely to be successful in creating change? International intervention or local grassroots campaign?
I think that it's never a dichotomy. It's never like either like local campaign or international support. The answer has always been a mixture of everything. Like you need to have like really strong local resistance movement so that the international community can come in and help. You also need to have a strong international assistance, because just how much imbalance in activism innately, when you compare it from like national apparatus to the influence that protesters have. The most salient one would be the use of violence. Countries has a legitimate use of violence. They have soldiers and they have all sorts of weapons that they can utilize. And if there isn't strong enough international pressure, no matter it's on a political front or economic front, they could easily deploy those things. We're seeing the latest one in Iran, where they are butchering protesters and dissidents. But also, you also need some sort of elite deflection in every democratization that we've observed. There are certain amounts of elites who were in the system that they have decided, no matter it is for their own sake or they think that that is the country's future, that they are willing to basically deflect. So I think like the answer is always a mixture of everything, and there is no equation. It is not like economists that you can model how much this and that matter, or there is no timing. It's very difficult to time. It's very difficult to time the market, right? And it's also even more difficult to time how and when a protest and revolution unfold. So I think in the arena of activism, it's always very fluid. You need to be very adaptive, and you need to pick up all sorts of signal to really find the appropriate strategy to work with. So I think the answer is it's a bit of everything. But the most important one, if you ask me, is definitely the willingness to protest, to take risk, and to show that there is a strong disapproval to the government, to a point that people have to risk their life and to protest. I think that is the basis of everything else. Without that, I don't feel like there will be changes that are positive changes. There are, of course, changes that are terrible, like a worse dictator replacing the dictator. It happens all the time. It happens when there isn't like a protest. It also happens where there is a protest. So I think to change for a better future, definitely the foundation is just how big and how influential the grassroots movement or even revolution looks like.
And sorry, just quickly following up with that. Speaking of grassroots campaigns, do you think they're doomed to fail because of this national security law and the power of the Hong Kong and Chinese governments?
I think in Hong Kong, yes, for now. It's been a few years since we last saw a protest in Hong Kong. And the reason is very clear. The Chinese government and the Hong Kong government, they've done so much in cracking down Hong Kong democratic movement. They've jailed hundreds of the most brilliant and bravest activists that has ever existed in Hong Kong. And they could get away from it. There isn't a strong pushback. They haven't really received much consequences because of their action. And the natural reaction from them is, why not? So everything that happens to these activists, high-profile activists, can happen to ordinary people. And in fact, there are so many ordinary people where they just hang a flag of protest outside their home, they just sing a protest song, they were just expressing their opinion, they were just making up like a children's book, they were arrested because of that. So I think that created a chilling effect, a sense of white terror. One of the things that can really demonstrate that kind of fear was, I think 1 or 2 years ago, BBC had done an interview in Hong Kong. They were going down to the street. It was like a few years after the implementation of the national security law, and many rounds of massive arrests to political dissidents in Hong Kong, and they were just going to the street asking how people feel about it. Like if it were 10 years ago, like people would love to spend time to just talk to them, to share their political opinion. But in that particular interview, most people were just like shying away from the camera and saying that, don't ask me, I'm in no position of asking, don't put me in danger, etc. I think that particular clip was very telling on what is the sentiment in Hong Kong, which is you're no longer able to express. And if people already had that kind of fear just by sharing their political opinion, then of course they're not going to do protest. They're not going to do anything even more provocative as a way of protecting themselves. So I would say that the Hong Kong activism or democratic movement is in the hibernating like environment where people just like, it is a big storm coming and people just lie down and then just taking care of themselves and then get stocked up. We will never know when the next protest or whether there will be a next protest. It really comes to whether the international sentiment was like the international sentiment would be there to force China to change its course or even like or just reflect on what they've been doing. But yeah, I would say that it's very difficult to do any activism in Hong Kong now.
Thank you so much for that. We've sort of talked a bit about the situation in Hong Kong, and I'd like to ask you about sort of also the situation in the UK itself. You've obviously lived here since 2020, but with recent developments such as in Manchester with the consulate sort of dragging people inside, attacking pro-democracy protesters, obviously spying on yourself as well. Do you feel the UK has done enough to sort of guarantee your safety? Do you think there is sort of safety from these sort of Chinese actors within the UK? And has your routine changed recently as well with these sort of new threats?
Yeah, so on the national policy layer, as we all know, the British government launched this BNO scheme. People who were born before 1997 in Hong Kong, they had this BNO, British National Overseas Passport. It was not something that can automatically grant you citizenship, and it was seen kind of like a useless passport back then. But because of the political crackdown in Hong Kong, the British government launched these humanitarian visa pathways where holders of the BNO passport can have like a pathway to reside and to become a citizen in the UK. It started in 2020, and for the past 5 years, there has already been close to 200,000 Hong Kong people that have come to the UK. So there's a big argument about the UK launching this visa scheme to help up Hong Kong people. But of course, I think when we look back to all the actions and speeches that the UK government has been making, it's definitely a lot of Hong Kong people would feel like it is fall short of the historic responsibility that they have, because they've signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. They've come to a consensus to kind of, in the long term, protect Hong Kong people's freedom and democracy. So it's fairly difficult to say that, oh, the British government has done everything that they can to help protect the Hong Kong people. On a personal level, I think I wouldn't say that I'm in a danger or like I'm not safe on a daily basis. I try to live like a normal person, that I stop myself being paranoid, even though there are clear signs of the Hong Kong government or Beijing trying to have access to my personal information and probably trying to create some trouble on my personal safety. But I would say that I'm relatively safe, and I'm connected. I have a connection. I have like a communication channel with the people that I need to talk to if I found anything that's endangering me. But definitely there are a lot of routine in my life. There are a lot of precautions in my life that ordinary people don't necessarily have to do. In regards to my travel, in regards to my daily commute, in regards to my internet footprint, in regards to my personal device safety, in regards to my situational awareness when I'm outside, there are many things that I try to internalize and adapt so that I can really make my life easier. So definitely there are a bit of like personal concern that ordinary people won't share.
Great. I think we'll move on to audience questions now. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and speak loudly if you're at the back. Any questions? Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. So I guess you mentioned that one of the important things is to make sure that there's a strong local resistance, right? And then you mentioned the word, right now the resistant force in Hong Kong is sort of in the hibernating environment. So my question to you is, how do you make sure that the local resistance is carry on and not dilute over time?
I can't guarantee it. It's very difficult. No one can guarantee that. Especially in my position, I have to accept that as the information environment is very closed and polluted with propaganda and government's mouthpiece, etc., I will be further away from what does it look like in Hong Kong on the ground. So that means I think I have to accept that the disconnection will grow, the gap will grow, and I would lose touch on a spectrum level about what's happening in Hong Kong. And I think as an overseas activist, as an exile activist, I have to recognize it and to admit that fact before I engage in giving people, let's say, any hopes or like any prospect that I may be able to have an impact in Hong Kong. So I think this is an awakening, a reckoning that people in my position or people who are trying to make changes but seemingly think changes are very difficult to make, that there's so much that you can do. Like there's so much that I can do. And I've been seeing my role as someone who just amplify what local resistance has been doing and saying, and I clearly know that the changes that is about to happen has to come from people on the ground instead of people like me who can speak about it, who can explain about it, but it's fairly difficult for me to organize and to stage anything. So yeah, I can't guarantee, and I think it takes a long time to have it reignited just because of how, I think there's a premises about there is a change of course in the Chinese Communist Party, so that situation in Hong Kong is a bit more relaxed and people are able to exercise their power. So yeah, I think there's still a long way to go.
Yeah.
I know you just said you don't know as well what's happening in Hong Kong now, as people that are in Hong Kong, but I'm wondering if you're aware of things that China is doing to kind of absorb Hong Kong that isn't high-profile arrests or isn't constitutional changes, like smaller things that are happening right now, like that kind of go under the radar.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think like it goes from all directions. Everything that I said is not going to be exhaustive because it happens in so many layers. Like in the most fundamental layer, it is like on the cultural level. Books I wrote, books are the democracy activist role. They are off-shelf, they become banned books. in the schools, they've been pushing forward Mandarin education, Putonghua education, instead of Cantonese education, which a language embodies so much culture and knowledge and history of one place. The way that they do it is just to annihilate Hong Kong people's uniqueness and their cultural identity. And of course, like all the cultural products, all the movies, all the episodes that they go through censorship, many that are deemed political inconvenience are not going to be aired. And all the things that they talk about on public TV or even like on the cinema, etc., has to be fitting the government's narrative. So there has been a lot of changes in what the cultural outlook, what the cultural scene looked like in Hong Kong. But of course, like there have been also demolishing the whole civil society. We've seen the last political pro-democracy political parties in Hong Kong disbanded a couple months ago. So there is no pro-democracy party left. In the Hong Kong kind of like traditional political spectrum, we can roughly divide it into two, like the pro-Beijing camp and the pro-democracy camp. 10 years ago, I was in the pro-democracy camp, and in every popular election that was without any censorship prior to 2020, we always got more than half of the popular vote. So there had been a really strong pro-democracy political force in Hong Kong, and now every one of them is gone. They are all disbanded. And then the civil society, workers' union, teachers' union, which were a big force of pro-democracy camp, they were disbanded. Student union that I was in, disbanded. There is a huge purge and annihilation in civil society, to a fact that I think it is not only affecting Hong Kong politically, but also on a lot of kind of like daily life issue, a lot of like social justice issue. It also take a lot of hits where people are just in no place that they can go against government's policy or even silly decisions that they've made. So the civil society has already collapsed. All media are now pro-Beijing. Jimmy Lai case, you basically have zero media in Hong Kong that are critical to the sentencing. The only voice that are coming out in regards to the sentencing was they're doing a good job. They're quashing seditious force in Hong Kong, and they have been they've been winning over the foreign intervention, etc. So the whole media landscape is so suffocated in Hong Kong, and yeah, I think like there are a lot to pick up how Hong Kong has been shaped in the past few years. I think like at the end of the day, the goal of the government is not only to make protest or dissidents disappear, but also they are kind of atomizing the community. They don't want people to form groups. They don't want people to form organizations. Once, in whatever means that people cannot form organizations, even though there are kind of disconnected descendants, like the government kind of take that. And it happens in mainland China for a very, very long time, that kind of trait. So it's just like, you could just imagine what's happening in mainland China, just slowly incorporating into the Hong Kong system.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Nathan. I wanted to ask about the issue of cultural identity, right? Because you mentioned that Hong Kong culture is being diluted because the government in China and Hong Kong are given free rein to implement Mandarin education and national education. What are some subtle ways for people back in Hong Kong to resist that kind of a cultural evolution? Because obviously you can't engage in overt political activism anymore. So what are some ways that we can sort of under the radar preserve, for example, the Cantonese language being the primary language in Hong Kong? And on the flip side, you mentioned that there's this growing gap between the people like yourself here in the UK who are from Hong Kong and the situation on the ground in Hong Kong, right? Do you have any suggestions as to how we can remedy that gap, how we can still maintain a sense of Hong Kongers as being Hong Kongers while we're in exile abroad?
Yeah, they're a very good question. So I think the first one, still like Cantonese is what Hong Kong people speak, is on TV. I think the status of Cantonese is not going to be threatened in a very short period of time, but we also see that kind of gradual disappearing scene. Like if you look at Tibet, if you look at Guangzhou in China, like those kind of language policy has been in place for decades, and it definitely playing out, damaging the kind of cultural identity and the language in those regions. So I think it would take a long process, but for now, there are so many signs that there is like a systematic, like policy level effort that's been ongoing. I think people are aware of that, but of course, it's very difficult for them to do like sort of collective things about it. Some of the very clear things that I've seen that they're doing is like on an individual level, like parents that they're trying to do their job, trying to talk to their kids with Cantonese, trying to educate them, or even like not only on a language level, but on like history, on political stuff. So they would manage to find a way to convey those messages. Also, like there has been a lot of revival of like small group book talk, film talk, etc. They're not necessarily just for the preservation of Cantonese, like more of like trying to preserve that kind of political discussion through the lens of culture, lens of art that are less provocative. But yeah, they also have the impact of getting people together and talk about things that potentially being seen as provocative. So I think like people are adopting it in different ways, and it also correlates to the ability for me, like the invisibility of those things for me, because things happening on the ground, like the only thing that I can, the only information channel that I have is from time to time where there are people coming out from Hong Kong, they're having a vacation in the UK, then I can catch up and talk. Or also like social media where like you put things on the internet. But if you are doing things that don't want to catch attention, you're not going to put it on the internet. So there is a certain, like no matter how hardworking I am patrolling on the open sea of social media, there are so much that I cannot pick up. And I think for an activist, we just have to be humble and honest about it. And I think it will help us understand the situation when we have this kind of understanding approaching to the information that we consume. So yeah, I think that is where we are in the kind of like cultural resistance. Sorry, I didn't get your second question.
It was, so what can Hong Kongers who have immigrated to the UK do to maintain their sense of identity as being from Hong Kong, so as to run in that gap between our existence here and the culture?
Yeah. It's also a great question, and it is a question that many young families have been asking themselves. I think like if you're over like 18 and then you came to the UK, it's pretty much everything has been sealed in your heart so that you kind of like continue to live as a Hong Konger or Hong Kong British in the long-term future. But there are many people who, through the VNO scheme, that have come to the UK, they're young families. And many of the young parents, they left because they are worried about the education in Hong Kong, that they have revamped it, and there's so much kind of like national education and CCP narrative that's been infused in the whole education system. And they've encountered these questions like, you're not living in a Cantonese-speaking environment, people around you, they're not Hong Kongers, so how can they preserve their identity? There's a big part of community work that people have been doing. They have movie night, they have cultural festival, they have like groups in different places in the UK where people can just get together and then to talk. There's also an influence of culture when local British, they watch In the Mood of Love or like watch Stephen Chow. Like there is a cultural pride that you can put it in yourself and then put it in your kids as well, so that they identify with Hong Kong a bit more. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think it takes a market solution. It takes enough demand for people to have Cantonese classes, Cantonese kind of like childcare, people have to have these sorts of services that are available and with a relatively affordable price, so that young families who don't earn a fortune, who are kind of like barely living by, can afford, and then to give them to their kids. So yeah, I think it is a combination of many layers of solution.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. You touched a little bit on, actually a lot on 2019 protests. Some criticize is the decentralized protest. Do you agree with it or not agree with it? Or do you think decentralization is a good thing or a bad thing? If we go back to 2019 again, can we do better?
Yeah, I think it is also a very good question that I often get asked. I think first of all, when you approach protests, many people would have like a misconception, thinking like, oh, there must be something that we can do, we can change the course of the protest. But so often as there are growing kind of adoption of these digital device, instant communication software, and the emergence of these like the decentralized protest philosophy, like I think it's very difficult for anyone to change course in the protest just because of how spontaneous and how explosive the emotion is, and how much actors there are in the movement. You could read about a bunch of high-profile people, but there are also a bunch of people who I know but you don't know, and there are many more that I don't know that are operating under the ground to kind of like support and maintain such a big movement. So I think it is always difficult to, as I said, to time it, to think about, to really like seeing it as something that you can push a button and then you can change the course. But I think the reason why that it was like a decentralized movement, it was a leaderless movement, was also the lesson learned from the 2014 umbrella movement, where the movement it was seen as a movement with leaders, like the student organization, the Occupy Central groups, etc. And there, after the movement, there was some criticism about the nature of that. The criticism was saying that because of the leaders, like when the leaders were arrested, the movement was easily crashed. So it may not be a good idea, or like there are some political philosophy that the leaders that they encouraged, and that kind of limit the imagination and kind of diversity and the range of actions and narrative that the protesters can adopt. So it makes protest less fluid and more rigid. There are also kind of like criticism about they don't like those leaders, etc. So I would say that there isn't right and wrong. If you look at what happens in 2019, I would rather look at as like an extension of protests. It's like a period of time. Like it's like when we talk about a successful revolution in certain history, we also think about a lot of failed attempts like before that. So I see the social movement as waves of history. So the 2019 and 2014, they are definitely interconnected, and there were a lot of features of the protest in 2019 were actually like people's reflection on the 2014 protest, and then they come up to a conclusion. Maybe the 2019 decentralized protest was much more accommodating to that historical time and place. So I think it was also because of that decentralized nature that it has such a big explosive amount of energy and participation from the people. So I think people have made their choice, and then they chose that movement in that shape.
Any more questions? Yeah.
I'd like to ask about the support you needed after leaving Hong Kong. What kind of support did you find most helpful after you moved to the UK? Or like what kind of support you wanted but you couldn't get and you wish you could get?
I almost want to say like Hong Kong food, like. No. Yeah, I think as an activist, you are in such a, you're always in a lot of conflicting priorities and needs. I think for me, as I understand that my influence or like my, yeah, like as I explained, like you, at the end of the day, you'll get out of touch. At the end of the day, you're not going to be as impactful as anyone else in Hong Kong when they can organize these protests. And as an activist, I think when we leave the country of origin, we will encounter a sort of like identity crisis. And I think different people have different approach to cope with that. Some would be an overseas activist staying in an activism organization, continue to campaign for Hong Kong. Some would be in academia. And I think this is a question that everyone has to answer. And for me, I think, of course, I wanted to continue to do things that matter to Hong Kong, that can raise awareness on Hong Kong. But I also wanted to be someone that I don't really have to rely on this issue to thrive and to be impactful and to make a change in what sort of environment that I'm in. I care about Hong Kong, but the longer that I stay in the UK, I care about the UK as well. I care about my community as well. So yeah, I think like my identity and my priorities are always kind of like shifting. And I don't want to be kind of like bound by Hong Kong activists, the only identity, even though I wanted to continue to contribute and support that. So actually, for now, I'm running programs that help UK, to help address UK's democracy problem. That I'm running a program that brings people like me who fled from unfree countries into UK's secondary schools to share their personal stories with the students. Because we've seen a lot of survey and polls showing that there is a growing distrust of young people to the democratic system in the UK, and there are a lot of consequences coming out from it. So my theory of change is if we can let them know a bit more of our stories, how does it look like living in an authoritarian regime and having to leave their country, like they would appreciate their democracy a bit more. The largest cohort I work with is North Korean. So you could pretty much imagine these North Korean speakers, they go into the classroom and they share how they escaped, how they were tortured in jail, and how they managed to come to the UK to the secondary school students. It created an instant impact in them. So there are different things that, because of my shifting concern and my newfound worries that I would restructure my life and I would contribute. So I would say that I think I need time and space to kind of be who I am. I don't need that much of expectation, but also in terms of resources, I think it would be very handy if I can use it to support the programs that I'm doing, to really show that for me, I care about values, I care about systems, and I want the same values to thrive in Hong Kong and also in the UK. So I think that these kind of structure and support, I could make good use of them.
Maybe one final question. Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to ask how applicable you think lessons from Hong Kong are to Taiwan, both for Beijing and for grassroots movements in Taiwan as well.
So on a kind of like meta level, I think Hong Kong is a fantastic place to just like to assess Beijing's political agenda. It's very clear that the things that they implement in Hong Kong is a symbol of how authoritarian or like what is the trajectory that they're going, and it definitely doesn't look good. So I think anyone who is thinking about the freedom of Taiwan can survive in one country, two system, which is like a failed example in Hong Kong, it's basically delusional. So I think that is the basis of the discussion. And of course, there are lots of tactics that they used in Hong Kong, for example, smearing, misinformation, information warfare, and how they try to connect with like gangster, local force, etc. These can be referenced, but I would also add a pinch of salt when we wanted to directly compare Hong Kong, what was happening in Hong Kong and the CCP strategy in Hong Kong to the Taiwan situation, just because there is a separate government, there is a separate system, there isn't like Chinese Communist Party, they can directly intervene Taiwan's policy, and there isn't like they can reinterpret Taiwan's constitutions to create an environment for them. So I think, yeah, it's just for reference, and I think there are lots of decisions about Taiwan that really has to take into account whether those are an imminent threat or just a way to discourage Taiwanese people from doing whatever they need to do to defend their place. So yeah, I think there's a big difference, and it's fairly difficult to draw the direct comparison.
Right, thank you all for coming to speak to Nathan today. A massive thank you to Nathan as well.